The smell of fried chicken filled the small apartment as Agent Victoria Thompson kicked off her black shoes and sank into the worn couch. After 12 hours of standing guard at the White House, all she wanted was to spend some quiet time with her big brother. David had always been her rock, the one person who kept her grounded even when her job demanded she protect the most powerful people in the world. "You look tired, sis," David said, handing her a cold drink. His voice carried that familiar concern that only family members have for each other. "When's the last time you actually relaxed?" Victoria laughed, but it came out more like a sigh. "Relaxed? What's that?" She looked around the apartment that David had called home for the past 3 years. The furniture was old but clean, and family photos covered every available surface. This place felt more like home than her own sterile apartment across town. David worked at a local community center, helping kids stay out of trouble. He'd been doing it for years, even when the pay barely covered his bills. That's just who he was, always putting others first. Victoria admired that about him, even if she worried he didn't take care of himself enough. They were halfway through dinner when they heard shouting outside. At first, they ignored it. City life meant dealing with noise, sirens, car horns, people, arguing. But this was different. The voices were getting louder, more aggressive. "What's going on out there?" David asked, walking to the window. Victoria joined him, peering through the thin curtains. Down on the sidewalk, she could see their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rose Patterson, surrounded by 2 men in regular clothes. The old woman looked scared and confused. She kept shaking her head and pointing toward her own apartment building. Mrs. Patterson was 82 years old and had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone could remember. She baked cookies for the kids and always had a kind word for everyone. Seeing her distressed made Victoria's protective instincts kick in immediately. "Those guys aren't from around here," David said, his voice tight with concern. "Look how they're standing. That's not how you talk to someone's grandmother." Victoria studied the scene more carefully. The men were definitely law enforcement. She could tell by their posture, the way they moved, how they positioned themselves. But something felt off. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the type of person who got into trouble with police. She barely left her apartment except to go to church on Sundays. "They're cops," Victoria said quietly. "But this doesn't look right." One of the men grabbed Mrs. Patterson's arm, making the old woman stumble. That was all Victoria needed to see. "Come on," she said, already heading for the door. "We need to help her." David didn't hesitate. He followed his sister out of the apartment, down the stairs, and onto the street. Victoria's training kicked in automatically. She assessed the situation as they approached. 2 plainclothes officers, 1 elderly civilian, no visible weapons drawn yet, but the tension was clearly escalating. "Excuse me," Victoria called out in her calm, professional voice. "Is everything okay here?" The first officer, a stocky man with graying hair, turned toward them with obvious irritation. "This doesn't concern you. Keep walking." But Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with relief when she saw them. "Oh, thank goodness. These men are asking me about someone I don't know. I keep telling them I don't understand what they want." Victoria stepped closer, her years of training helping her read the situation. The officers were clearly frustrated, possibly looking for someone who wasn't Mrs. Patterson. But instead of realizing their mistake, they seemed determined to make the old woman answer questions she couldn't understand. "Officers, I think there might be some confusion here," Victoria said, keeping her voice steady and respectful. "Mrs. Patterson has lived in this building for over 20 years. Maybe you're looking for someone else?" The second officer, younger, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything, stepped forward. "Like I told your friend here, this isn't your business. We're conducting an investigation." "But I don't know anything about any investigation," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking. "I just came outside to check my mailbox." Victoria could see how scared the elderly woman was. Her hands were trembling and she kept looking around as if hoping someone would explain what was happening. This wasn't right. Whatever these officers were looking for, they had the wrong person. "Can I ask what this investigation is about?" Victoria asked. She kept her tone professional, the same way she spoke to other law enforcement officers during work. Maybe we can help clear this up. You can help by minding your own business and walking away, the older officer said, his voice getting harder. David moved to stand beside Mrs. Patterson. His presence seemed to calm her down a little, but Victoria could see the situation was getting more tense, not less. Look, officers, we're not trying to interfere with your work, David said. We just want to make sure Mrs. Patterson is okay. She's a good neighbor, and she's obviously confused about what you're asking her. The younger officer's hand moved slightly toward his belt. Victoria noticed the movement immediately. It was subtle, but she'd been trained to catch these things. The officer wasn't drawing his weapon, but he was positioning himself like he might need to. Sir, please keep your hands where we can see them, the younger officer said to David. My hands? David looked down at his own hands, confused. I'm not doing anything with my hands. Victoria felt her heart rate increase. This was exactly how situations went from bad to worse. Misunderstandings, fear, people talking past each other instead of listening. She'd seen it happen before, though usually from the other side. Officers, let me show you my identification, Victoria said, reaching slowly toward her purse. I think this might help explain things. But even as she spoke, she could see both officers tense up. They were seeing threats where none existed, interpreting every movement as potentially dangerous. Mrs. Patterson, David, and Victoria herself. None of them were doing anything threatening, but somehow the officers seemed convinced they were dealing with a dangerous situation. The evening had started so peacefully, just a sister visiting her brother, sharing a meal and catching up on each other's lives. Now they were standing on a sidewalk, trying to protect an elderly neighbor from what seemed like a case of mistaken identity gone wrong. Victoria's training told her to de-escalate, to find common ground, to solve the problem before it got worse. But something in the officer's body language worried her. They weren't listening, they weren't trying to understand. They were treating Mrs. Patterson like a suspect and treating anyone who tried to help her like accomplices. Please, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want to go back inside. I don't know what you want from me. The older officer stepped closer to her. Ma'am, we're going to need you to answer our questions first. But I don't understand your questions, she replied, tears starting to form in her eyes. Victoria realized they were at a crossroads. She could walk away, take David, and go back upstairs and let Mrs. Patterson deal with this on her own. Or she could stay and try to help, knowing that her presence might make the officers more suspicious and defensive. Looking at the scared old woman, there was really no choice at all. Mrs. Patterson needed help, and Victoria had sworn an oath to protect people. That oath didn't only apply when she was wearing her uniform. The warm evening air felt heavy with tension as more neighbors began to notice what was happening. A few people had come to their windows, watching the scene unfold. Victoria could feel the weight of their attention, the way situations like this could quickly draw a crowd. She took a deep breath and prepared to try once more to make the officers understand they had the wrong person. But something in their eyes told her that reasoning might not be enough. The evening was about to take a turn that none of them were prepared for. The older officer's patience was clearly running thin. Detective Ray Collins had been working the streets for 15 years, and lately, every call seemed to end in complications. 3 armed robberies in the past month, all in this neighborhood, all involving suspects who looked nothing like the frightened elderly woman standing in front of him, but his partner had insisted they follow up on every lead, no matter how unlikely. Ma'am, we received a tip that someone matching your description was involved in suspicious activity, Detective Collins said, his voice getting sharper. We need to verify your identity and ask you some questions. Mrs. Patterson looked even more confused. Suspicious activity? I haven't done anything suspicious. I go to church, I buy groceries, I watch my television shows. What kind of suspicious activity? Victoria stepped forward slightly, keeping her movement slow and deliberate. Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Could you tell us what specific activity you're investigating? Maybe we can help clear this up quickly. Officer, Jake Mitchell, the younger man, had only been on the force for 3 years, but he'd already seen enough violence to make him jumpy. The neighborhood had a reputation, and his training sergeant had drilled into him that hesitation could get you killed. When civilians started asking questions and getting involved, it usually meant trouble. "Like we told you before, this is police business," Officer Mitchell said. "We need you to step back and let us do our job." "But your job is to protect people like Mrs. Patterson, not scare them," David said, moving closer to the elderly woman. "Look at her. She's terrified. She doesn't know what you want from her." Detective Collins felt his frustration rising. Why couldn't people just cooperate? Every time they tried to investigate something in this neighborhood, residents would gather around asking questions, making accusations. It made everything 10 times harder. "Sir, I'm going to need you to take several steps back," Detective Collins said to David. "Right now." "I'm not doing anything wrong," David replied. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk trying to help my neighbor understand what you want from her." Victoria could see how quickly things were deteriorating. Both officers were getting more defensive, treating reasonable questions like acts of defiance. She'd seen this dynamic before. Law enforcement officers who felt challenged would sometimes double down instead of stepping back and reassessing the situation. "Officers, please," Victoria said, trying to inject calm into her voice. "We all want the same thing here. You want to do your investigation, and we want to make sure Mrs. Patterson is safe and comfortable. Can't we work together?" "The way you can help is by walking away," Officer Mitchell said. "This woman is going to answer our questions, and if you keep interfering, you're going to be answering questions too." Mrs. Patterson started crying softly. The whole situation was beyond her understanding. In all her 82 years, she'd never had police officers treat her like she was some kind of criminal. She'd raised 4 children in this neighborhood, buried her husband after 43 years of marriage, and spent her retirement years helping anyone who needed it. "Please don't cry, Mrs. Patterson," David said gently. "It's going to be okay." But his words of comfort seemed to make Officer Mitchell even more agitated. "Stop talking to her," Officer Mitchell snapped, "and keep your hands where I can see them." "My hands are right here," David said, holding them up slightly. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm trying to comfort an old lady who's scared." Detective Collins was starting to wonder if they should call for backup. What had seemed like a simple follow-up interview was turning into some kind of standoff. The suspects from the robberies were still out there, and here they were, wasting time with people who seemed determined to obstruct their investigation. Victoria realized she needed to identify herself as law enforcement, but she also knew she had to be careful about how she did it. Reaching for identification too quickly could be misinterpreted, especially with 2 officers who were already on edge. "Officers, I'd like to show you something that might help explain why we're concerned," Victoria said slowly. "I'm going to reach into my purse very slowly to get my wallet. Is that okay?" "What's in your wallet that we need to see?" Detective Collins asked suspiciously. "My identification," Victoria replied. "I think once you see it, this whole situation will make more sense." Officer Mitchell exchanged a glance with his partner. In their experience, when people started talking about identification that would make things make sense, it usually meant they were about to claim some kind of connection or authority they didn't actually have. "Go ahead," Detective Collins said, "but move very slowly." Victoria reached into her purse, her movements deliberate and visible. But as she pulled out her wallet, Mrs. Patterson suddenly swayed on her feet. The stress and fear were taking their toll on the elderly woman. "Oh," Mrs. Patterson gasped, reaching out to steady herself. David immediately moved to catch her, his quick movement startling both officers. "Don't move," Officer Mitchell shouted, his hand going to his weapon. "She's falling," David said, catching Mrs. Patterson's arm to keep her from hitting the ground. She almost fainted. The scene had gone from tense to dangerous in a matter of seconds. What looked like a helpful gesture to David and Victoria looked like a sudden, potentially threatening movement to the officers. "Step away from her right now," Detective Collins ordered, also moving his hand toward his weapon. "She needs help," Victoria said, her training telling her to de-escalate immediately. "She's an elderly woman who's overwhelmed. She's not a threat to anyone. But the officers weren't seeing a helpful gesture or a medical emergency. They were seeing what looked like two people coordinating some kind of action, possibly trying to help a suspect escape or create a distraction. More neighbors had come to their windows and doors. Someone was recording with their phone. The situation was attracting exactly the kind of attention that made police officers nervous and defensive. "Everyone needs to step back and calm down," Detective Collins said, but his own voice was getting louder and more aggressive. "We are calm," Victoria said. "You're the ones who are escalating this." "Escalating," Officer Mitchell said. "You're the ones who inserted yourselves into a police investigation. You're the ones who won't follow simple instructions." Mrs. Patterson was leaning heavily on David now, still crying softly. She kept saying she wanted to go home, that she didn't understand what was happening. Victoria realized that her attempt to show identification had been interrupted by Mrs. Patterson's near-fainting spell. The officers still had no idea who she was, and their suspicion was growing by the minute. "Officers, please listen to me," Victoria said. "I'm trying to tell you something important about who I am. If you'll just let me finish getting my identification out, this whole situation can be resolved. What we need is for you to stop telling us what to do," Detective Collins replied. "We're the law enforcement officers here. We're the ones in charge of this situation." The irony wasn't lost on Victoria. She was a federal law enforcement officer with more training and experience than both of these local cops combined. But because they didn't know who she was, they were treating her like just another interfering civilian. "You're in charge of bullying, an old lady?" David asked, his own frustration finally showing. "Is that what being in charge means?" Officer Mitchell's face flushed with anger. "Watch your mouth, or you're going to find yourself in handcuffs." "For what?" David demanded. "For helping someone who was about to fall down?" The situation was spiraling completely out of control. What should have been a simple case of mistaken identity was turning into a confrontation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Victoria knew she had to find a way to break through the officer's defensive mindset, but every attempt at communication seemed to make them more suspicious and angry. The longer this went on, the more dangerous it was becoming for all of them. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost feel it pressing down on everyone. Mrs. Patterson was still leaning on David, her breathing shallow and quick. Victoria could see that the elderly woman was having a panic response. Her body was shutting down from the stress and fear. "She needs to sit down," Victoria said firmly. "Look at her, she's having a medical emergency." "The only emergency here is people not following orders," Officer Mitchell shot back. His hand hadn't moved away from his weapon, and Victoria could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was scared too, though he was trying to hide it behind aggression. Detective Collins was watching the growing crowd of neighbors. More people had come outside, and several were holding up phones. This was exactly what he didn't want. A public incident that would end up on social media before they even finished their reports. "Everyone needs to go back inside, Detective," Collins called out to the crowd. "This is police business." But nobody moved. They knew Mrs. Patterson, and they could see she was in distress. Some of them had been helped by David at the community center. They weren't just going to walk away. David helped Mrs. Patterson lean against a nearby car. "It's okay," he whispered to her. "Just breathe slowly. You're going to be fine. Don't move her," Officer Mitchell barked. "Nobody gave you permission to move her." "Permission?" David's voice rose with disbelief. "She's about to collapse, and you want me to ask permission to help her?" This was the moment Victoria realized just how badly the officers had misread the situation. They weren't seeing a community member helping an elderly neighbor in distress. They were seeing what looked like coordinated resistance to their authority. "Officers, please." Victoria tried again, speaking directly to Detective Collins, who seemed like the more experienced of the two. "This woman needs medical attention. She's 82 years old, she has high blood pressure, and you're causing her to have a panic attack." "How do you know she has high blood pressure?" Detective Collins asked suspiciously. "Are you related to her?" "I'm her neighbor," Victoria replied. "I know her medical history because she's mentioned it to people in the building. This is what good neighbors do, we look out for each other." But Officer Mitchell was focused on something else entirely. David's movements as he helped Mrs. Patterson had looked deliberate and purposeful to him. In his 3 years on the force, he'd learned that suspects often used medical emergencies as distractions. "Step away from her right now," Officer Mitchell commanded David. "Put your hands up and step back." "Are you serious right now?" David asked, his voice filled with incredulous anger. "You want me to let an old lady fall down so I can put my hands up?" "I want you to follow orders before this gets worse for everybody," Officer Mitchell replied. Victoria could see that they were at the breaking point. Everything in her training told her that someone was about to make a decision that couldn't be taken back. She had to get these officers to understand who she was before things went completely off the rails. "I'm a federal agent," Victoria said loudly and clearly. "I'm with the United States Secret Service, and I'm telling you that you have the wrong person." For a split second, both officers paused, but instead of de-escalating, Victoria's declaration seemed to make Officer Mitchell even more agitated. "Sure you are," he said sarcastically. "And I'm the President of the United States." "I'm not joking," Victoria said, reaching slowly for her wallet again. "My badge and credentials are right here. Don't reach for anything," Detective Collins shouted, suddenly much more alert. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The situation was deteriorating faster than Victoria had ever seen in her professional experience. She was trained to handle high-pressure situations, but usually everyone involved understood what was happening. This was different. These officers didn't believe her, and every attempt to prove her identity was being treated as a threat. David was still supporting Mrs. Patterson, who was now breathing in short, rapid gasps. The elderly woman was clearly having a full-blown panic attack, but the officers seemed to interpret her distress as acting. "She's really sick," David said desperately. "Can't you see that? She needs help." "What she needs is to answer our questions," Detective Collins replied. "And what you need is to stop interfering with a police investigation." Victoria realized that the officers had dug themselves so deep into their incorrect assessment of the situation that admitting they were wrong would be almost impossible for them. They'd invested too much in the belief that they were dealing with uncooperative suspects. "Look around you," Victoria said, trying one more time to make them see reason. "Look at this woman. Look at the neighbors watching. Does this really seem like a dangerous criminal situation to you?" Officer Mitchell's frustration exploded. "You want to know what seems dangerous? People who won't follow simple police orders. People who keep arguing and making excuses and trying to interfere with an investigation." "What investigation?" David demanded, his own anger finally boiling over. "You haven't told us what crime you think she committed. You haven't explained. What evidence you have? You're just harassing an old woman and calling it police work." That was the moment everything changed. Officer Mitchell saw David's raised voice and animated gesture as the final act of defiance. In his mind, this had gone from a simple interview to a full confrontation with multiple hostile suspects. His training kicked in, but it was the wrong training for this situation. "Gun!" Officer Mitchell shouted, even though David wasn't holding anything but his empty hands. The word "gun" triggered an immediate response from Detective Collins. Both officers drew their weapons in one fluid motion, pointing them directly at David and Victoria. Victoria's world slowed down to a crawl. She could see the muzzles of the guns, the tension in the officers' trigger fingers, the terror in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. Every second of her Secret Service training came rushing back. Assess the threat, protect the civilians, de-escalate if possible. "Federal agent," Victoria shouted at the top of her voice, her hands up but ready to move. "Secret Service, stand down." But her identification of herself as law enforcement only seemed to confuse the situation more. To Officer Mitchell, it sounded like someone impersonating a federal agent, which was a serious crime in itself. "Nobody move!" Detective Collins screamed. "Everybody freeze right where you are!" Mrs. Patterson let out a terrified scream that echoed off the buildings around them. The sound seemed to shake everyone, the officers, the watching neighbors, even Victoria herself. This was an 82-year-old woman who had never hurt anyone in her life, and she was caught in the middle of what looked like it might become a shooting. David instinctively moved to shield Mrs. Patterson with his body, which the officers interpreted as another threatening movement. "I said don't move," Officer Mitchell yelled, his weapon trained directly on David's chest. Victoria had seconds to make a decision that could save lives or cost them. She could see that both officers were beyond reasoning with, their adrenaline and fear making them see threats everywhere. Mrs. Patterson was in immediate danger of having a heart attack from the stress. David was one wrong move away from being shot. The neighbors were screaming now, some of them running inside, others shouting at the officers to put their guns away. The whole scene was chaos, but at the center of it were two scared cops with loaded weapons pointed at three people who had never committed a crime. Victoria knew that whatever happened in the next few seconds would change all their lives forever. She had trained for situations like this, but never from this side of the equation. Never as the person with guns pointed at her by fellow law enforcement officers who refused to listen to reason. The evening air was filled with shouts and screams, and the sound of Mrs. Patterson's labored breathing. Somewhere in the distance, sirens were approaching. Someone had called 911. But Victoria wasn't sure if help was coming or if more confusion was about to arrive. Time seemed suspended as everyone waited to see what would happen next. 2 guns, 3 civilians, and a catastrophic misunderstanding that was about to reach its breaking point. The crack of gunfire split the night air like thunder, but the shots weren't aimed at anyone. They were warning shots, fired into the air when Officer Mitchell's finger slipped on the trigger during the chaos. The sound was deafening, echoing off the apartment buildings and sending everyone into a panic. Mrs. Patterson collapsed completely, her legs giving out as her heart couldn't handle any more stress. David caught her as she fell, both of them ending up on the concrete sidewalk. Victoria threw herself forward, covering both of them with her body, her Secret Service training taking over completely. "Don't shoot!" someone screamed from the crowd of neighbors. "They're not armed!" Detective Collins felt his world spinning out of control. Warning shots were supposed to be a last resort, and now they had an elderly woman on the ground in chaos, erupting all around them. This wasn't how investigations were supposed to go. "Victoria," David called out, his voice tight with fear. "Mrs. Patterson isn't breathing right." Victoria was pressed against the sidewalk, shielding the elderly woman and her brother, but she could hear Mrs. Patterson's wheezing, irregular breaths. The woman was going into medical shock and every second counted. "She needs an ambulance," Victoria shouted, not moving from her protective position. "Right now." Officer Mitchell was still pointing his weapon, but his hands were shaking. The sound of his own gunfire had startled him as much as anyone else. He hadn't meant to fire. It had been an accident triggered by his own adrenaline and fear. "Put the guns down!" someone yelled from the crowd. "She's dying!" Victoria knew she had one chance to end this before someone actually got killed. Still covering Mrs. Patterson with one arm, she used her other hand to pull out her credentials. But instead of just showing her badge, she threw her entire wallet onto the ground, where both officers could see it clearly. The black leather case fell open, revealing the distinctive gold Secret Service badge and federal identification card. Under the streetlight, there was no mistaking what it was. Detective Collins saw it first, his weapon lowered slightly as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. After 15 years in law enforcement, he knew what a real federal badge looked like, and this was definitely real. "What the hell?" he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Officer Mitchell was still focused on what he perceived as the threat, but Detective Collins grabbed his partner's arm. "Jake, look at the badge," Detective Collins said urgently. "Look at what?" she threw down. Officer Mitchell's eyes followed his partner's gaze to the credentials on the ground. Even in his panicked state, he could see the official seal, the federal identification, the photograph that clearly matched the woman lying on top of the elderly civilian. "Secret Service," Victoria called out, still not moving from her protective position. "Agent Victoria Thompson, badge number 2847. I'm federal law enforcement, and this woman needs medical attention immediately." The transformation in both officers was instant and dramatic. Their weapons lowered, their aggressive postures changed, and suddenly they were looking at the scene with completely different eyes. They weren't looking at suspicious criminals anymore. They were looking at a federal agent protecting a civilian who was having a medical emergency. "Oh God," Officer Mitchell breathed, his face going pale as he realized what had almost happened. "Oh God, what did we do?" The sirens were getting closer now, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Detective Collins looked around at the crowd of neighbors, many of whom were still recording everything with their phones. This was going to be a disaster for everyone involved. "Agent Thompson," Detective Collins said, his voice completely different now, respectful, professional, apologetic. We didn't know. We thought—" "I tried to tell you," Victoria replied, still not moving from her protective position over Mrs. Patterson. "I tried to show you my identification. I tried to explain." Mrs. Patterson's breathing was getting more labored. Victoria could feel the elderly woman's body shaking with shock and fear. Every second they spent talking was a second that Mrs. Patterson wasn't getting the medical help she desperately needed. "Someone call an ambulance," David shouted. "She's really sick." "Already on the way," Detective Collins said quickly, speaking into his radio. "This is Detective Collins. We need EMS to our location immediately. Elderly female, possible cardiac event." The first backup unit arrived just as Detective Collins was making the call. Two uniformed officers jumped out of their patrol car, weapons ready, expecting to find their colleagues in a dangerous confrontation. Instead, they found Detective Collins and Officer Mitchell standing over a federal agent who was protecting a civilian on the sidewalk while a crowd of neighbors watched in horror. "What's the situation?" Sergeant Williams asked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Misunderstanding," Detective Collins said quietly. "Major misunderstanding." Victoria finally lifted her head to look at the new officers. "Agent Thompson, Secret Service," she said clearly. "This civilian needs immediate medical attention. She's elderly and she's in shock." Sergeant Williams had been a cop for 20 years and he'd never seen anything quite like this. A federal agent on the ground protecting what appeared to be an elderly resident, while two of his officers stood nearby, looking like they'd seen a ghost. "What happened here?" he asked Detective Collins quietly. We were investigating." Detective Collins struggled to find words. "We had the wrong person. We made a mistake." The ambulance arrived within minutes, its red and blue lights flashing across all the faces in the crowd. The paramedics quickly took over, gently moving Victoria aside so they could attend to Mrs. Patterson. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the lead paramedic asked, kneeling beside the elderly woman. "We're here to help you." Mrs. Patterson's eyes were open, but she looked confused and frightened. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, and her heart rate was erratic. The stress of the confrontation had pushed her body beyond its limits. "She has high blood pressure medication," David told the paramedics. "She lives in apartment 3B. I think her pills are up there." Victoria slowly got to her feet, brushing dirt and debris from her clothes. Her protective instincts were still running high, but she could see that the immediate danger was over. The officers had holstered their weapons, and medical help was taking care of Mrs. Patterson. "Agent Thompson," Sergeant Williams said, approaching her carefully. "I need to understand what happened here." Victoria looked at him, then at Detective Collins and Officer Mitchell, then at the crowd of neighbors who were still watching everything unfold. "Your officers were investigating something and they had the wrong person," Victoria said simply. "When my brother and I tried to help our elderly neighbor, the situation escalated. I identified myself as federal law enforcement multiple times, but they didn't believe me." Officer Mitchell looked like he was going to be sick. "I almost shot a federal agent," he said quietly. "I almost shot a Secret Service agent." "You almost shot 3 innocent people," David corrected, his anger still simmering. "Mrs. Patterson could have died from the stress you put her through." The paramedics were preparing to transport Mrs. Patterson to the hospital. Her condition had stabilized, somewhat, but she clearly needed more medical attention than they could provide on the scene. "I'm going with her," David announced, climbing into the ambulance. Victoria watched her brother disappear into the ambulance, then turned back to face the officers and the growing crowd of onlookers. She knew that what happened next would be crucial for everyone involved. The misunderstanding was over, but the consequences were just beginning. 3 weeks later, Victoria sat in a conference room at the federal building, facing a panel of investigators from 3 different agencies. The incident had triggered automatic reviews from Internal Affairs, the Secret Service, and the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Everyone wanted to understand how 2 local police officers had nearly shot a federal agent. Agent Thompson, the lead investigator, said, "Can you walk us through the decision points that led to this confrontation?" Victoria had told this story so many times that she could recite it in her sleep. But each time she told it, she remembered new details. The fear in Mrs. Patterson's eyes, the sound of David's voice when he was trying to comfort their elderly neighbor, the moment she realized the officers weren't going to listen to reason. The officers were focused on their investigation to the point where they couldn't see what was actually happening, Victoria explained. They interpreted every attempt to help Mrs. Patterson as resistance to their authority. The investigation had revealed that Detective Collins and Officer Mitchell had been looking for a suspect in a series of armed robberies. Someone had called in a tip about a suspicious elderly woman in the neighborhood, but the description had been vague and the caller had refused to give their name. Instead of treating it as the unreliable tip it was, the officers had decided to follow up aggressively. When they found Mrs. Patterson checking her mail, they convinced themselves she matched the description well enough to justify questioning her. "What troubled us most," the investigator continued, "was their failure to recognize your credentials when you attempted to show them." Victoria nodded. "They had decided we were all suspects and nothing we said or did was going to change their minds. That's a dangerous mindset for any law enforcement officer." Mrs. Patterson had spent 2 nights in the hospital, recovering from what doctors called a stress-induced cardiac event. The elderly woman's blood pressure had spiked so high during the confrontation that she'd nearly had a heart attack. She was home now, but she hadn't been the same since that night. David visited her every day, bringing groceries and checking on her well-being. The community center where he worked had organized neighborhood watch meetings to discuss better communication with local police. Everyone was trying to make sure something like this never happened again. Detective Collins had been suspended pending the completion of all investigations. His 15-year career was likely over, though no criminal charges had been filed. He'd requested a transfer to desk duty if he was allowed to return to work at all. Officer Mitchell had resigned from the force entirely. The young officer couldn't handle the knowledge that he'd nearly killed 3 innocent people over a mistaken identity case. He was seeing a counselor and talking about finding a different career path. Agent Thompson, another investigator, asked, "Do you plan to pursue civil action against the department?" Victoria had thought about this question for weeks. She could probably win a significant lawsuit against the police department. The incident had been recorded by multiple neighbors, and the evidence of excessive force was clear. But lawsuits didn't change the underlying problems that had caused the incident in the first place. "I'm more interested in making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Victoria replied. "Civil rights lawsuits are important, but they're not the only solution." Instead of filing a lawsuit, Victoria had proposed a different approach. She wanted to work with the police department to develop new training programs focused on de-escalation and interagency cooperation. She wanted officers to learn how to recognize when they might be wrong, not just how to assert their authority. The Secret Service had embraced her proposal enthusiastically. Federal agents often worked with local law enforcement, and miscommunication could be dangerous for everyone involved. Victoria's experience had highlighted gaps in training that needed to be addressed. "The goal isn't to punish individual officers," Victoria explained to the panel. "The goal is to create systems that prevent these misunderstandings from escalating to dangerous levels." The police department, facing potential federal oversight and community outrage, had agreed to implement Victoria's training program. Officers would learn about federal law enforcement procedures, proper credential verification, and, most importantly, how to step back and reassess situations when civilians raised legitimate concerns. Mrs. Patterson had become an unexpected advocate for police reform. Despite her age and her traumatic experience, she started attending city council meetings to talk about the need for better community policing. Her gentle but firm testimony had moved city officials to action in ways that angry protests might not have. Nobody should be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them, Mrs. Patterson had told the city council at their last meeting, and police officers shouldn't have to be afraid of the people they're trying to help either. Victoria's story had attracted national media attention, but she'd been careful about how she handled interviews. She didn't want to demonize local law enforcement or create more division between communities and police departments. The officers made mistakes, Victoria had told one national news reporter. But they're not evil people. They were poorly trained for a complex situation, and they let their assumptions override their judgment. That's something we can fix through better training and clearer procedures. The incident had also led to changes in how federal agents identified themselves to local law enforcement. The Secret Service had developed new protocols for off-duty agents who found themselves in situations where they needed to reveal their law enforcement status. Victoria's supervisor had been impressed with her handling of the entire situation. "You could have created a huge incident between federal and local law enforcement," he told her. "Instead, you found a way to turn a near disaster into an opportunity for positive change." David had been less forgiving of the officers involved, but he'd channeled his anger into productive activism. He'd organized community meetings where residents could share their experiences with local police and suggest improvements. The meetings had been tense at first, but they'd gradually become more constructive. "Change doesn't happen overnight," David had told one gathering of neighbors. "But it does happen when people are willing to do the hard work of talking to each other and finding solutions." 6 months after the incident, Victoria received a letter from Officer Mitchell. He was working as a security guard at a local hospital and taking night classes in social work. He wanted to apologize again for what had happened and to thank her for not destroying his life with a lawsuit. "I realize now that I never should have been a police officer," he'd written. "I was too quick to see threats and too slow to listen to people. I'm trying to learn how to help people instead of just controlling them." Victoria had written back, encouraging him to continue with his counseling and his education. Everyone deserved a chance to learn from their mistakes and become better. The training program Victoria had developed was now being used by police departments in 12 states. Federal law enforcement agencies were sharing their expertise with local cops, and local departments were learning to work more effectively with their federal counterparts. Mrs. Patterson had fully recovered from her medical emergency, though she still got nervous when she saw police cars in the neighborhood. Victoria and David made sure to check on her regularly, and the whole community had rallied around her with support and friendship. "You know what the strangest part is?" Mrs. Patterson had told Victoria recently. "I'm not angry anymore. I was scared and I was hurt, but I'm not angry. Those officers made mistakes, but they're trying to do better now. That's all any of us can do." Victoria agreed. The incident had been traumatic for everyone involved, but it had also created opportunities for understanding and improvement that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Sometimes the worst moments in people's lives became the foundation for the best changes they could make. And sometimes, when people were willing to work together instead of against each other, even the most frightening misunderstandings could lead to lasting positive change. The evening that had started with a simple family dinner and ended with guns drawn had ultimately become a catalyst for reform, understanding, and healing. It wasn't the outcome anyone had expected, but it was the outcome that everyone had worked together to create.